Welcome back, everyone. This is Dane, pharmacist at MD Custom RX Pharmacy. Was excited to do another video here, and I didn't know exactly how to tie everything I wanted to talk about together. We're going to talk about free radicals. We're going to talk about antioxidants. We're going to touch again on the mitochondria. We're going to touch on enzymes. We're going to touch on nitric oxide. We're going to touch on cofactors, tetrahydrobiopterin, 4-nitric oxide. We're going to touch on methylene blue. And I'm thinking, how do I tie all this in? And then I had that like eureka moment. It's oxygen. So we're going to discuss a little bit about oxygen, but oxygen kind of ties everything in, as I mentioned previous here. Oxygen itself is actually a free radical. So oxygen alone, like a single oxygen atom, does have an unpaired electron, and electrons do like to orbit the nucleus in pairs. I'll mention that one time again later in this video, but you'll have two oxygens, O2, together, and they are kind of neutralized and happy. But in order to get some energy from oxygen, we actually split the O2 into two single oxygen atoms. But they're looking to either accept electrons or really accept electrons. So if it accepts one electron, it becomes a super-oxide, which I'll talk about later, which is another free radical. If it accepts two electrons, it'll actually become hydrogen peroxide, which is another free radical. But that will be kind of the undertone as you learn about free radicals coming up and antioxidants and the mitochondria with the electron and oxygen that it needs for ATP. So just know oxygen in of itself, the single oxygen atom, is actually a free radical. It exists mostly as O2. Our ozone layer, I believe, is O3. But it does give energy up as you break it down, as you split those oxygens apart, except they're going to look to react with anything to get some electrons back. So just keep that in mind moving forward. So a free radical, you might have heard this term before. A great example, or a couple maybe great examples here of what free radicals do. There's a chemical process called oxidation. That's one way free radicals react with something. So when you cut an apple open, for instance, that browning that occurs is actually from an enzyme that's causing it to brown, but that's because the oxygen in the air that those enzymes are exposed to are stealing electrons from that apple, and this is causing it to rot. That's how rust is created. Rust is metal reacting with the atmosphere, with oxygen, getting electrons stolen from it. A couple chemical processes there, but basically the oxygen and a little bit of moisture can cause that rust. Same things can kind of happen in your body here with free radicals. So free radicals are essentially a molecule that has an unpaired electron. So electrons like to hang out in pairs. So they orbit the nucleus, kind of like the planets orbit the sun, but they like to orbit in pairs. If you have a lone electron, that whole molecule is desperate to either pair that electron up or just get rid of that electron. So the free radical is a highly reactive molecule willing to, again, pair that electron up or give away that electron. That can actually be a great thing depending on where it is in the body, but it also can be unbelievably destructive, again, depending on when it exists and where it is in the body. Some free radicals only exist for a millionth of a second, so this is such a short lifespan. But again, if that pops up, highly reactive, and is nearby a biological process that may not need any reactivity coming from the outside world, so to speak, it can influence how that process works. Okay, I did speak about the free radicals theory of aging in my last video, the bigger video on methylene blue, and the idea being that the free radicals and their destructive behavior can disrupt biological processes down to the level of DNA, which is the roadmap of a cell, right? It's a blueprint of a cell. So if you have a blueprint for a house, and the house is supposed to be made a certain way, and all of a sudden someone screwed up a 5 and it looks like a 2 or something for, say, the length of one of those rooms. Well, now the blueprint shows that room is slightly different. That whole house, in essence, is going to be a slightly different house. So with that room being a little off, the blueprint, the DNA getting a little skewed, all those cells being made moving forward are going to be less like the original perfect, clean processing cell that you had in the beginning. So antioxidants were originally researched to help prevent food from rotting, then later to help prevent the corrosion of metals and manufacturable materials, rubbers. Then it landed in the biological community, and they were trying to prevent the oxidation of lipoproteins. So low density lipoproteins, LDL oxidized version, is kind of a starting piece to atherosclerosis, which is going to be a disease state that can cause death downstream. So the body loves homeostasis. It loves balance. It's always fighting for a level of balance, the yin and yang of the body. So I talked about free radicals, but there is kind of the opposite piece, the antioxidant. So what that does is it's a molecule that's going to inhibit or delay the oxidation, so the creation of a free radical. Really, that's it. I mean, it's something that's going to inhibit or delay the oxidation of a molecule to become a free radical. I mean, it can neutralize them too if the molecule is something that, for instance, I talked about in the methylene blue video, and we have to touch on the mitochondria again here today. There was a part I didn't talk about in the methylene blue video. As I talked about those 5 complexes, I didn't really touch on complex 3. I didn't touch on cytochrome C, which is a protein that helps transfer electrons from those complexes, that electron transport chain, right? If that gets dysfunctional, like free radicals are being made during that chain as that's going to create ATP. Remember, oxygen, electrons, we're getting ATP down that chain. There are free radicals that are made during that process, but they're kind of almost tightly wound to the membrane and they don't get free. If that becomes dysfunctional, those free radicals actually can get unbound and free, and now they're around to react with any other parts of the cell, whatnot, and disrupt things. Okay, so the mitochondria has 11 sites to do that. 11 sites to do that. So what I'm getting at here is methylene blue is really, it acts because it can donate an electron or receive an electron. It's kind of acting like a free radical and an antioxidant at the same time. A free radical pops off. Let's say that it has an electron it wants to donate. Methylene blue can accept that. If it has an electron and it just needs to pair up, methylene blue can give it. So that's one way that a highly reactive species, a free radical, or even an antioxidant at the right place can be extremely beneficial. But more often than not, when the body's fighting for homeostasis, what causes permeation out to disease states and morbidity is an imbalance of that. So too many free radicals, the body gets overwhelmed. It sends in messengers because it realizes one of these processes in the body is disorganized. So it sends in messengers, like those are alarms going off. It sends in chemical messengers, inflammatory markers, primarily immune system markers, and they all join the party trying to scavenge things out. But again, if they get overwhelmed, it just becomes crowded and becomes a feedback loop of molecules and crowding where everything gets more or less disorganized and leads to destruction of the biological process, and then downstream leads to disease states, and downstream obviously that can lead to morbidity, mortality. So I did do a seminar in our live stream channel and our YouTube. If you go in our live stream, there's a whole like 40 minutes something little presentation I did on nitric oxide and all its benefits, but it does everything from enhanced endurance to neuroprotective properties, enhancing the immune system. It helps with blood pressure. It can be anti-lipidemic, or it can help with cholesterol. So and many more or less. It's a messenger molecule, so it helps the body function better overall. It's a survival piece for the body. I argued that in the presentation because you can kind of find a lot of conflicting evidence out there whether or not nitric oxide is going to be good in abundance or bad. I think both camps are correct, but we need to put this to rest, or at least get a clearer understanding of when nitric oxide is good and when it's bad, and what we can do to keep it on the good side. So nitric oxide is actually created endogenously in the body, so from within. It's a poison exogenously outside the body, but the body does need it for things even down to the red blood cell releasing oxygen into tissue needs nitric oxide to help with that release. So nitric oxide is made from 3 different pathways. There is the endothelial nitric oxide synthase, it's called. So these pathways are enzymatic, meaning an enzyme is something that would be seen as like a tiny little factory. It's going to take a couple products once they land on it and conform and turn them into a different product overall. That's what an enzyme is going to do. So the pathways to create nitric oxide, there's 3 enzymatic pathways. There's an endothelial nitric oxide synthase pathway, so that's going to be found in your vasculature and some of your arteries and your veins. There is the inducible nitric oxide synthase. This is the one that can start to cause some issues. It's called on by the body. I feel like in panic mode sometimes, but that one can produce 1,000-fold more nitric oxide than the other 2 I'm going to talk about. But the inducible nitric oxide synthase can be called on by cells on command. And then there is their neuronal nitric oxide synthase. Okay, so the neurons have their own pathway. So a really important note though, the endothelial nitric oxide synthase and the neuronal nitric oxide synthase, these 2 are calcium dependent. The inducible nitric oxide synthase is not. That's a big takeaway here. But it's cool to know that your brain has its own nitric oxide synthase creative pathway because 60% of your brain is fat. It's using 20% of your oxygen. It demands a lot. So it's nice to know that it has its own routes to certain survival pieces it needs. Again, about balance. Water, necessary for life. We have to drink it or receive it IV, but we need water. Too much of it can cause death. That's just a perfect showing of balance. Nitric oxide is similar. We need nitric oxide to be produced for survival. Too much of it can cause oxidative stress, which is going to lead to a host of different free radicals that we talked about are bad, and it's going to lead to inflammatory markers and inflammatory cascades that are going to also be bad, and chronic inflammation can lead to disease states and those morbidities. So too much water, bad, just enough, good survival. Too much nitric oxide, bad, just enough, good survival. Just keep that in mind. So how can nitric oxide go awry? So as I said, those are enzymatic pathways. Enzymes are like a little process. They use things called a substrate and they use things called cofactors, which are other building blocks that they're going to use to convert into a different product. If one of those building blocks gets skewed, let's say by a free radical, or it itself gets oxidized and still leads or meets this enzyme, the enzyme may still turn it into what it thought was the right product, but that product, that end result might be a little skewed, okay? Now that can cause a host of problems downstream. In the case of nitric oxide, there is a big cofactor that we need called tetrahydrobiopterin. So tetrahydrobiopterin, I'm just going to call it BH4, is a cofactor necessary for nitric oxide production. If that BH4 becomes oxidized, if it becomes reactive, if it reacted with a free radical or something along the way before it gets to the eNOS or iNOS or nNOS, those nitric oxide pathways, that enzyme's still going to use it and try to create nitric oxide, but it actually creates something called a super-oxide. It's essentially a free radical on steroids. It's just a really reactive free radical. So not so good for the body. Now, what's going to happen from this is the body senses that, again, there's going to be some disorganization. Free radicals processes aren't working as well. Maybe the mitochondria is not getting as much oxygen now because it's got superoxides that are blocking some of the complexes, etc. Whatever cell component's not getting building blocks because we got free radicals kind of gunking up the works here. The body's going to send in its inflammatory markers. Now we have inflammation. So even if one piece along this network to build nitric oxide gets oxidize, let's say from a free radical coming in and oxidizing it. However, it can make nitric oxide, the end product, nitric oxide, it can actually make that become a superoxide. Okay, so that is one thing. If we could protect or try to limit its oxidation, that would be something very beneficial for us. So that might be a part you'd want to focus on. There is a, well, I don't know if you want to call it a molecule or a supplement. It's actually, I guess you could call it a molecule. I believe it's from red grapes. It's called resveratrol. That has some studies showing that it actually helps upregulate BH4, that cofactor, and it's going to help downregulate some things that could potentially cause the oxidation or that BH4 cofactor becoming skewed, where we'd create a superoxide. So resveratrol would be something that you could supplement in order to help nitric oxide production. I forgot to mention some examples of free radicals and also antioxidants. So an example of a free radical, I do mention superoxide as a net result from nitric oxide if one of the nitric oxide pathways, one of the cofactors, so a building block in that pathway, has become oxidized or affected by like a free radical. So I said it was a superoxide, and that is indeed a free radical. Another example of a free radical is hydrogen peroxide. So antioxidant side of things, we have inside of the body that we organically make would be alpha lipoic acid and glutathione. And outside of the body, we supplement like vitamin C and vitamin E. So these are some examples of free radicals and antioxidants. I did mention resveratrol. That is going to help as an antioxidant, but in kind of a specific manner to help the nitric oxide pathways stay more stable so they can net result nitric oxide and not that superoxide. And they did that, or resveratrol helps do that by preserving a cofactor, BH4. So when that cofactor comes in and it's creating nitric oxide, it does that instead of being oxidized, making weird stuff, and creating a superoxide, which the body responds with inflammatory markers, and it also will try to upregulate more nitric oxide to help that cell survive, because nitric oxide pathways are a survival piece for the cell, which causes a big loop. We have more inflammatory markers than the body's doing the inducible nitric oxide. Remember, that's the non-calcium dependent nitric oxide. So it's trying to push more in, but if it's oxidized and there's a lot of free radicals, that pathway is just causing more superoxides. I think of like visually like just fireworks going off in a cell, a balloon. It's just pure chaos potentially there. So very important to make sure, even though free radicals are going to exist, they're inevitable in our cells, making sure we have them under control with enough antioxidant supplementation around, so those free radicals don't cause alarms and other pathways that we don't want in that biological process being activated. Hopefully that makes sense, because I know I talked about free radicals, talked about antioxidants, but I didn't give you examples outside of resveratrol, methylene blue, and the superoxide being a free radical there. But those others were antioxidants, more or less. If I were to supplement certain things, and I do, I would supplement resveratrol, which I do. I would supplement vitamin C, vitamin E, which I do both of those. Alpha lipoic acid, which I certainly do. I would also supplement L-citrulline, L-arginine. That helps boost the nitric oxide precursors. Those are building blocks for those pathways. I supplement those as well. I would find probably a good multivitamin that has either sourced ingredients that are validated, or that and has good bioavailability, meaning like, for instance, if you wanted to get magnesium in your body, magnesium citrate's more or less a laxative. You don't absorb it. It kind of flushes things out of your system. But if you tie an amino acid to it, chelate it, that magnesium is now absorbable. So that's some of the things I would look for. Hopefully off this video, you realize that antioxidants are important, and you want to have those in abundance in the body. So supplementing those is a great idea. And then supplementing for those finer nuanced pieces, right? I do want high amounts of nitric oxide to be created if my body needs it. So it needs building blocks, L-citrulline, L-arginine. I'm going to do that. I want to make sure that BH4 is protected, which is that cofactor, because the nitric oxide pathway will still try to create that product, but if the BH4 is skewed, it'll still create a product. It's just a superoxide, which is bad. How do we help BH4? Like I said, one good thing is resveratrol. So those would be a couple things that I would supplement with. I love methylene blue. I think it's a phenomenal product to use. As I explained previously in this video, it pairs awesome with nitric oxide. It's going to limit the bad nitric oxide, or the one that's most likely to get in trouble, that inducible nitric oxide pathway, while also mitigating against free radical destruction. Okay, so hopefully we kind of get an idea of like some things you may want to supplement with, got a little more educated. Comment if there's any issues. I try to reply to those comments as much as possible, okay? Thank you for your time.